The moment Dorothy Hadley stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she had exactly 14 cents in her coat pocket, a battered carpetbag that had seen better days, and the kind of quiet dignity that no amount of poverty could strip from a woman who had decided she would not be ashamed of either. The town of Caldwell sat at the southern edge of Kansas, right along the Kishom Trail, and it was the kind of place that smelled of cattle and ambition and whiskey in equal measure. The main street was rutted from wagon wheels and boot heels, and the hooves of thousands of longhorns that had been driven north through here every season since the trail had opened up. Buildings stood in uneven rows on either side, some freshly painted and hopeful, others weathered and leaning as if exhausted by the effort of standing. A general store, a land office, a hotel that called itself the Drover's Rest, a saloon with music already drifting out of it even though the afternoon sun was still hanging high and merciless. Dorothy stood on the plank sidewalk with her carpetbag at her feet and looked at all of it with steady brown eyes that missed very little. She was 24 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark brown hair pinned up beneath a practical bonnet and a face that was honest more than it was beautiful. A face that people looked at twice not because it was striking, but because there was something in it that made them feel they were being seen clearly. She had high cheekbones dusted brown from the sun, a straight nose, and a mouth that was accustomed more to thinking than to smiling, though when she smiled it changed her entirely. She had come to Caldwell because she had nowhere else to go. That was the plain truth of it, and Dorothy was a woman who dealt in plain truths. Her father, Elias Hadley, had died in February of a fever that swept through their small farm outside of Wichita, leaving behind debts that swallowed the farm whole and left Dorothy with the 14 cents, the carpetbag, and the knowledge that she could cook, sew, keep accounts, and read better than most men she had ever met. Her mother had been gone since Dorothy was 12. She had no siblings. She had a second cousin in Caldwell named Mabel Prout who ran a boarding house, and Mabel had written back saying there was a room and occasional work if Dorothy could get herself there. Dorothy picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the boarding house address she had memorized. She did not see Bernard Lockhart until she walked directly into him. He was coming out of the land office with a rolled map tucked under one arm and his hat pushed back on his head, reading something on a folded piece of paper, and she was walking with her head forward and her mind somewhere else entirely, calculating the distance to the boarding house, and they collided squarely in the middle of the sidewalk. The carpetbag dropped. The map went skidding off the edge of the planking into the dust. The folded paper crumpled between them. He caught her by the elbow before she went over entirely, and for one moment they were very close together, close enough that she could see the particular shade of his eyes, which were the gray-green of sage after rain. "I beg your pardon," he said immediately, and then he bent to pick up her carpetbag before she could reach it herself. "I am equally at fault," Dorothy said, straightening her bonnet. "I was not watching where I was going." He handed her the carpetbag with a slight nod, then stepped off the planking to retrieve his map from the dust, shook it, and rolled it back up. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean through the shoulders in the way of a man who worked hard and ate simply, with brown hair that curled a little at the neck beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. He wore plain working clothes, a canvas shirt and sturdy trousers and boots that were dusty but well-made. He was not exactly handsome in the way that made women turn around in the street, but there was something about his face that was honest and considered, a face that looked as though it took its time before it decided anything. "Are you all right?" he asked, looking at her directly. "Perfectly," she said. "Are you?" He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Good enough," he said, and touched the brim of his hat and walked on. Dorothy walked on too in the opposite direction, and did not think about him again for several days. Mabel Prout was a round, cheerful woman of 37 with red hair going to gray, and the particular competence of someone who had learned early that if she did not manage everything herself, nothing would be managed at all. She welcomed Dorothy with genuine warmth, installed her in a small room at the back of the boarding house that caught the morning light, and put her to work the very next morning helping to serve breakfast to the 8 men who lodged there. In return, Dorothy received the room, meals, and a small weekly wage that would allow her to begin saving. It was not glamorous work. Dorothy had not expected glamour. She carried plates heaped with biscuits and gravy and fried salt pork, refilled coffee cups, cleaned the long table when the men had gone, swept the floors, helped with laundry twice a week, and kept Mabel's account books in the evenings because Mabel's arithmetic had always been approximate at best. She was good at all of it in the silent, efficient way of someone who has understood since childhood that work is not an indignity, but simply a thing that needs doing. The men at the boarding house were a mixed collection, as the men of Caldwell tended to be. There were 2 cattle buyers who came and went with the season, a telegraph operator named Simmons who was polite and quiet and read scripture at the table, a young wrangler called Pete who was barely 20 and homesick and talked too much to cover it, an older man named Carver who dealt in horses and smelled strongly of the animals he loved, a cattle drover named Wes Harmon who was loud and cheerful and told stories about trail drives that lasted until Mabel cleared her throat and pointed at the clock. And then there was Bernard Lockhart, who had taken a room at the Drover's Rest in town but came to Mabel's boarding house for his meals because, as he told Mabel directly when he made the arrangement, the hotel kitchen produced food that tasted of nothing in particular, and he had been told that Mabel's table was worth walking 6 blocks for. Dorothy did not recognize him immediately the first morning he appeared at breakfast. He had cleaned up since their collision on the sidewalk, and he sat at the far end of the table and said very little, reading a folded map between bites of biscuit. It was only when she refilled his coffee and he looked up and said, "Thank you," with a slight pause that suggested he recognized her too, that she placed him. "The land office," she said quietly so as not to interrupt the general noise of the table. "Yes," he said, "and the sidewalk. You lost your map to the dust." "It survived," he said and glanced at the one spread beside his plate. Then he looked up again and there was something careful and attentive in his expression. "Are you settled here?" "I work here," she said simply, and moved on to the next cup. She was not a woman who invited pity, and she was not a woman who explained herself without cause. She had said what was true, and that was enough. Bernard Lockhart, she gradually learned over the following days, was a rancher. He had come to Caldwell to negotiate the purchase of a parcel of land about 12 miles south of town, just inside the Kansas border near the Indian Territory line. He was in the process of establishing a cattle operation of his own, having spent the previous 5 years working as a trail boss on drives up from Texas, saving money with the focused intention of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to build. He was from Tennessee originally, had come west at 22, and had learned the cattle business from the ground up. She learned these things not from Bernard himself, who was not a man who volunteered information about himself, but from Wes Harmon, who seemed to know everyone in the cattle business and was happy to talk about all of them. She also learned that Bernard Lockhart had a reputation for being fair and reliable, that he paid his men on time, that he had never left a drive short, and that the cowboys who had worked under him tended to speak well of him. Dorothy filed this information away in the same careful way she kept Mabel's account books, organized and not immediately acted upon. The conversation that changed things between them happened on a Tuesday evening in early May, about 2 weeks after Dorothy's arrival. She was sitting on the back step of the boarding house in the last of the daylight, working through Mabel's accounts by the fading light and a small lantern she had set on the step beside her. The evening was warm enough that the back door stood open, and the yard beyond smelled of the lilac bush that grew in determined disarray along the back fence. Dorothy had her ledger book on her knees and a pencil behind her ear, and was deeply absorbed in reconciling the month's figures, which did not want to reconcile because Mabel had a habit of paying for things in small amounts spread across several weeks and recording each payment under a different category. She heard footsteps on the path along the side of the house, and then Bernard Lockhart appeared around the corner, carrying his hat in one hand. He had clearly come around the outside rather than through the house. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment he just stood there, and she looked at him over the top of the ledger. "I did not mean to interrupt," he said. "You did not," she said, which was a small lie but a forgivable one. "Mabel asked me to let you know she has kept a plate warm for you. You missed supper." "I was at the land office until they closed," he said. He did not move away, and she did not go back to the ledger immediately, and the pause extended just long enough to become something other than accidental. "How is the negotiation going?" she asked. He looked at her with a slight expression of surprise, as if he had not expected her to know about it. "Slowly," he said. "The owner has a different idea of what the land is worth than I do. What is your argument?" He came and leaned against the fence post at the corner of the step, which put him close enough to talk without raising their voices into the quiet evening. He looked at her steadily. "The land has good grass and a creek that runs dependably, but the title has a complication from a previous claim that the owner has not fully resolved. I'm not paying full price for a parcel with an unresolved title." "That seems reasonable," Dorothy said. "He does not think so," Bernard said. "He thinks I should trust his assurance that the problem will be sorted out after the sale. And you do not trust assurances without documentation." He looked at her again with that slight arrested quality as if he was recalibrating something. "No," he said, "I do not." "Neither do I," she said, and went back to the ledger. He did not leave immediately. He stood leaning against the fence post and watched her work for a moment, and then he said, "You are keeping accounts." "Mabel's," she said. "She has a generous spirit toward arithmetic, which means her books require some reconstruction at the end of each month." "You were trained as a bookkeeper." "I was trained as a farmer's daughter," Dorothy said, without looking up from the figures. "Which meant learning whatever needed to be learned. Bookkeeping was one of those things. I had a teacher who believed that women had no less capacity for mathematics than men and should be educated accordingly. She was unusual for the region." "She sounds sensible," Bernard said. "She was remarkable," Dorothy said, and this time there was something warm in her voice that was separate from the discussion of mathematics. He went around and came up the back step and knocked at the open door so that Mabel would know he was there, and Mabel called from inside that his plate was in the warmer, and he went in. But as he passed Dorothy on the step, he paused again. "I am glad the carpetbag survived the collision," he said. She looked up and found him almost smiling again, that same almost smile she had noticed the first day on the sidewalk. And this time she did smile fully, and it changed her face in that way it had, and she saw him notice it. "So am I," she said. After that, conversation between them became a regular thing. Not dramatic, not the way of men who pursue women with the theatrical urgency of dime novel heroes. It was quieter than that and more real. He made a point of arriving for meals on time. She made a point of not avoiding the portions of the work that brought her past where he sat. They talked about the land negotiation, which eventually resolved in Bernard's favor when he produced documentation proving the title complication was real and not trivial, and the owner agreed to a reduced price with a delayed closing while the claim was sorted. They talked about cattle and the economics of running a small operation in a changing market. They talked about the books Dorothy was reading, borrowed from the small lending library that the church maintained, and discovered that Bernard had opinions about books that surprised her in their depth and specificity. He had read more than most men she had known. He explained this without apology. He had spent a great many evenings on trail drives with nothing to do once the cattle were settled, and the fire had burned down except read by whatever light he could manage, and he had made a habit of it early and never lost it. He liked history and good travel writing, and the occasional novel if it was honest about human nature rather than sentimental about it. Dorothy respected this more than she might have expected. The other men at the table noticed. Wes Harmon noticed most vocally, making a comment one morning at breakfast about how Lockhart seemed to have developed a fondness for prompt mealtimes, which produced a round of knowing laughter from the assembled men. Dorothy set down the coffee pot and looked at Wes Harmon with an expression so perfectly and pleasantly neutral that he stopped laughing first and said something about the weather. Bernard, across the table, said nothing, but she caught the corner of his mouth moving and looked away before either of them gave anything further away. It was on a Saturday afternoon in late May that Dorothy went to the general store to pick up a supply order for Mabel and encountered a difficulty. The store was run by a man named Aldous Greaves, who was in his early 50s and had a particular way of looking at young women who came in without male accompaniment that Dorothy found offensive in its transparency. He had been passably civil to her in the week since she had arrived, because she was Mabel Pruitt's cousin and Mabel was a good customer, but today he was in a different sort of mood. When Dorothy presented Mabel's supply list and Greaves began pulling items from the shelves, he paused over the last entry and turned to look at her with an expression that made her still. "Mabel's running a tab that's gotten considerable," he said. "I'm going to need something against it before I can keep extending credit." Dorothy kept her expression even. "Mabel has never defaulted on her accounts," she said. "That may be," Greaves said, "but times are tighter and I am reviewing all my arrangements." Dorothy knew this for what it was. She had done the books. Mabel's account at the general store was at a point where it was significant, not because Mabel was irresponsible, but because the winter had been lean and several of her boarders had paid late. Dorothy had it in hand, and the balance was going to come down over the next 2 months. But she did not have anything to offer Greaves against the tab today, because the cash she carried was exactly enough for the items on the list and nothing more. "I will speak with Mabel," she said, with a composed dignity that cost her something to maintain. "We can come to an arrangement." "I am sure you can," Greaves said, in a tone that suggested he thought the arrangement might involve something other than money, and the look he gave her was long and deliberate enough that her skin crawled. She picked up what she had paid for outright, left the rest on the counter, and walked out of the store. She was standing on the sidewalk outside, reorganizing the packages she carried when Bernard appeared beside her. He had been at the hardware store 2 doors down, apparently, and had seen her come out of the general store with a look on her face that he later described as the kind of look a person has when they have just swallowed something they refuse to spit out in public. "What happened?" he asked directly. She almost said nothing, because her instinct was always to manage things herself and not burden others with her difficulties. But something about the directness of the question, the way he did not soften it into something polite and deflectable, made her answer honestly instead. She told him about the tab. She told him about Greaves's suggestion that it needed securing. She did not tell him about the way Greaves had looked at her, but something in her telling communicated it anyway, because Bernard's expression shifted into something quiet and level that she would not have wanted aimed at her. "How much is the tab?" he asked. "That is not your concern," she said immediately. "I know it is not," he said. "How much?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with that steady gray-green attentiveness that did not waver or soften into something easier. $17.40, she said. He reached into his vest pocket, counted out the bills and coins, and held them out to her. She did not take them. She looked at the money and then at him, and she said with a kind of quiet fierceness, "I am not a charity case, Mr. Lockhart." "I know that," he said. "It is a loan against Mabel's account. Mabel can repay me when the account is stable, which you yourself would know is a matter of 2 months on the current trajectory." She paused. He was right on the numbers, because he had apparently listened carefully enough during their conversations to have a reasonable picture of Mabel's financial situation. That was either impressive or unsettling or both. "Mabel should have been consulted," Dorothy said. "Mabel is not the one standing on the sidewalk with packages," Bernard said. He did not say it unkindly. He said it as someone who considered logistics practically. Take the money. Go back in there and settle the account and get the rest of what Mabel needs. I will wait here." She took the money. It felt important in that moment to be very clear with herself about why she was taking it. Not because she was helpless, and not because he had offered, but because it was the practical solution to a practical problem. And the woman who had taught her arithmetic had also taught her that pride without pragmatism was not virtue, but obstruction. She went back inside. She settled the account with Greaves, who looked at her with a different kind of calculation now that she had produced the money, a calculation she liked only slightly better than the previous one. She collected the rest of the supply order, thanked him in a tone that was precisely and deliberately the temperature of cool water, and walked back out. Bernard was leaning against the post outside, watching the street. He straightened when she came out and took 2 of the packages without being asked. They walked back toward the boarding house. For half a block they did not speak. Then Dorothy said, "Thank you." "You are welcome," he said. Another half block of silence. "I will make sure Mabel knows of the arrangement," Dorothy said. "She will want to thank you herself." "She does not need to make a fuss over it," he said. "She is Mabel," Dorothy said. "She will make a fuss over it regardless of what you want." He almost laughed. She heard it in the small sound that escaped him before he contained it. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was smiling too, and that the smile was not a performed thing but entirely genuine, and that walking down the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the late afternoon sunlight with packages from the general store, she felt something that she had not felt in a considerable time, which was that things might possibly work out. Mabel did make a fuss. She appeared at the boarding house door when they arrived, took in the sight of her cousin and Bernard Lockhart arriving together with the supply packages, and her face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling on a warm and knowing delight that she made no effort whatsoever to conceal. She insisted Bernard stay for supper, which he had already been planning to do. She insisted on the best chair at the table. She pressed a second helping of everything on him with the focused generosity of a woman who considered feeding people to be a primary expression of affection. Bernard bore it with good humor and a patience that Dorothy thought said something about him. That evening after supper, Mabel contrived to be very busy with something in the kitchen when Bernard remained at the table with his coffee, and Dorothy, who was clearing the last of the dishes, paused when she came back from the kitchen and found that the room had been emptied except for him. She set down the dish she was carrying and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, with the directness she could not help, "She is very transparent." "Yes," he said. "She means well." "She always means well," Dorothy said. "It does not make her any less transparent." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her with that careful, attending expression she had come to expect from him. "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask," she said. "Whether I answer is a separate matter." "Fair enough," he said. "What are your plans for yourself beyond working here?" She considered the question. She considered deflecting it. She decided not to. "I am saving money," she said. "I would like to eventually have enough to take some kind of more permanent position. A schoolteacher's position, if one becomes available in the region. I was told there is sometimes a need for teachers in the smaller settlements around Caldwell. I can teach reading and arithmetic and a reasonable amount of history and science." "You have thought about it carefully," he said. "I have thought about most things carefully," she said. "It is a habit I find useful." He nodded slowly, still watching her, and then he said, "Dorothy." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she went very still, not with discomfort but with a kind of alertness. He noticed that he had used it too, she could tell, because he paused slightly before continuing. "I want to say something plainly, and I want you to hear it plainly, without interpreting it as something it is not." "All right," she said. "I am going to be in Caldwell for several more weeks while the land transaction finalizes," he said. "And I have been glad of the conversations we have had, and I would like to continue them, and I would like to know if that is agreeable to you." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is very carefully worded," she said finally. "I am a careful man," he said. "I know," she said. "Yes, It is agreeable to me." The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them, the quality of something being built with attention and without rushing. They talked every evening, on the back step when the weather was good, and at the kitchen table when it was not. They argued about things in the pleasant way of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's thinking, about whether the cattle market would sustain what Bernard was planning to build, about a novel Dorothy was reading that she thought was honest about human nature, and he thought was merely cynical about it, about the question of whether the new railroad routes coming through the region would ultimately help or hurt the small ranching operations as opposed to the large ones. He took her riding one Sunday afternoon, because she mentioned she had grown up on a farm and knew how to ride but had not had occasion to recently, and he had a pair of good horses he had acquired as part of his preparations for the ranch. They rode south out of Caldwell into the flat, wide country that opened up beyond the edge of town, the grasslands running in every direction under a sky so large and blue it seemed impossible. And Dorothy, who had been closed in town and the boarding house for weeks, felt something in her chest open up like a window being raised. She sat her horse well, which pleased her on some private level, and she could tell it pleased Bernard too, not in a surprised way but in the way of someone seeing a thing confirmed that they had suspected. "Tell me about the land you are buying," she said, when they had ridden far enough from town that the sounds of it faded behind them. He told her. He described it with a specificity that made it vivid. The creek that ran along the western boundary, willow trees growing along it, good shade and reliable water. The grass that was thick and blue-stemmed in the low places where water gathered in spring. The rise at the north end of the property where the land lifted slightly and from which, on a clear day, you could see a considerable distance across the plains. The place where he intended to build the house, facing east to catch the morning light. She listened and looked at the grass moving in the wind around them and thought about mornings. "It sounds like something worth building toward," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice had a different quality when he said it, quieter and more personal. "It does." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon. She looked at the horizon too, and neither of them said anything for a long minute, and the grassland moved and the sky was enormous, and something settled between them that was larger than either of the things they had been talking about. When they rode back toward town as the afternoon tilted toward evening, they rode side by side and their horses were close enough together that occasionally their stirrups nearly touched, and neither of them moved apart. June brought heat and more cattle through Caldwell, and with the cattle came the drovers, which meant the saloons were busy, and the streets were noisier, and Mabel's boarding house was full with additional men who wanted good meals and did not care much about staying for conversation. Dorothy's days became longer and more demanding, and she moved through them with her characteristic efficiency and without complaint, but she was genuinely tired by the end of most evenings. Bernard noticed. He noticed most things she had come to understand. He began arriving at breakfast earlier and finding small ways to be useful without making a production of it, carrying heavy things from the kitchen, moving furniture when the room needed rearranging, fixing a loose board on the back step that had been a hazard for weeks because it was not anybody's particular job. Mabel accepted this assistance with the satisfaction of someone whose scheme was proceeding exactly as planned. Dorothy accepted it with a more complicated feeling, something that was gratitude and warmth, and also a slight frustration at herself for how much she looked forward to his presence every day. She was not a woman who had spent her life expecting or hoping for a man to appear and change things. She had expected, pragmatically, to manage things herself, because that was what her life had taught her. She was not opposed to the idea of love or marriage in principle, but she had not held it as a defining ambition. She had watched enough women in Wichita trade their independence and judgment for the security of a man's name, and found the transaction uneven in ways that troubled her. She did not want to be managed or softened or reduced, and Bernard did not manage or soften or reduce her. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He listened to her opinions with genuine attention and pushed back when he disagreed with them, which she valued more than automatic agreement. He did not seem to find her directness alarming or unfeminine. He did not correct her when she spoke about finances or cattle or property titles in the mixed company of the boarding house table, even though most of the other men seemed mildly unsettled by a woman who had opinions about land prices. In late June, Bernard's land transaction finally closed. The title complication had been resolved, the documentation was in order, and the parcel south of Caldwell was legally his. He came to dinner that evening with something lighter about him, a quality of relief that showed in the set of his shoulders and the way he moved through the room. And when Dorothy met his eyes across the table, he looked at her with an expression that she did not pretend to herself. She did not understand. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the other boarders had drifted away to the sitting room or their rooms, Bernard found Dorothy in the kitchen finishing the washing up, and Mabel found a very important reason to be elsewhere almost immediately. "The land is mine," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. "I know," she said. "Mabel told me when you arrived. Congratulations." "I am going to start building in 2 weeks," he said. "I have 2 men coming down from Abilene who are good with construction. The house is nothing elaborate, practical, but solid." She dried her hands on the towel and turned to look at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed and watching her with that expression she had learned to read as the one that meant he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "Bernard," she said. "Dorothy," he said. "Say what you are going to say," she said. "You have been building toward it for several minutes." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth breaking through the composure, and he uncrossed his arms and came into the kitchen and stood a few feet from her. "I want to ask you to walk out with me," he said, "properly, as a formal intention, not because I am passing through and it is convenient company, but because I intend to stay in this region and build something real here, and I would like to know if you might consider being part of what I am building. I am not asking for an answer to that larger question tonight. I am asking you to walk out with me and let us see where that leads, and I am being direct about my intentions because I think you deserve directness and I would not want to insult you with anything less." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the dish towel she still held in her hands, and then she looked up at him. "I should tell you something," she said, "before you make this intention any more formal." "Tell me," he said. "I have 14 cents, she said. "Or rather, I did when I arrived. I have somewhat more now, because I have been working. But I have no property, no inheritance, no family connections that would be any use to anyone, and no prospects that a person with a practical eye would consider significant. My father's farm is gone to debt. I am entirely dependent on my own labor, and I intend to remain so, which means I am not a woman who will set aside her own mind because it is convenient for someone else." She said all of this evenly, not with shame and not with defiance, just with the plain clarity she had always considered her most reliable characteristic. Bernard looked at her for a long moment when she finished. His expression did not change in the way she might have braced for, the slight recalibration of a man reassessing an investment. He looked at her steadily and then he said, "Good. I was not looking for property or inheritance or useful connections. And I have known since about the 3rd conversation we had that your mind is your own, and you will not be setting it aside for anyone, which is not a warning I need, Dorothy. It is a quality I actively value." She had not expected those words. She had expected acceptance, because she had come to believe he was an honest man, but she had not expected that exact combination of words in that exact order, which made the thing she had announced as a potential liability into something he was naming as a preference. She felt the back of her eyes sting unexpectedly, which surprised her because she was not a woman who cried easily or often. "Good," she said when she trusted her voice. "Then yes, I will walk out with you," he smiled. Fully this time, the contained version given way to something genuine and unguarded, and it changed his face in a way that she suspected nobody saw very often, The way her smile changed her own. She thought privately that they might have that in common, something kept beneath the surface most of the time, not as concealment but as conservation, saved for occasions that warranted it. "Saturday afternoon," he said, "if you can be spared from here." "Mabel," Dorothy said, "will find a way to spare me. She has been engineering this for weeks." "She has," Bernard agreed. "She is very obvious about it." "She means well," Dorothy said for the second time on that subject. "She does," he said, and touched the brim of his hat even though he was indoors and not wearing it, a habitual gesture, and it made her almost laugh. Saturday afternoon came and they walked. They walked out of Caldwell and south along the edge of the trail road, where the grass was thick and unmarked by cattle hooves, and the afternoon light lay golden and long across everything. They talked about Tennessee, where he had grown up, on a small farm in a valley that had been beautiful and poor in equal measure. He had left at 22 not because he did not love the land of it, but because there was not enough of it, and the future he could see from there was too narrow for what he wanted to build. He had come west because that was where space was, and where a man willing to work could create something out of nothing, or nearly nothing. She told him about her father, about Elias Hadley, who had been a good man and a determined farmer, but had been fighting the Kansas weather and the Kansas soil for 20 years with the quiet courage of someone who did not know how to give up, and who had finally been beaten not by drought or poor harvest, but by a fever that came in January and did not leave. She spoke about him without sentimentality and without bitterness, with the clear-eyed affection of someone who had loved a person honestly and grieved them honestly, and was now carrying that grief in the way that grief gets carried when it has been properly processed, as a weight you know the measure of rather than one that surprises you. Bernard listened to all of it. He did not try to fix anything or minimize anything or find the bright side. He just listened, which she thought was one of the rarest and most valuable things a person could do. "What was the name of your teacher?" he asked, when she had mentioned her again in passing. "The one who taught you that mathematics was not only for men." "Mrs. Clara Yount," Dorothy said. She had taught school in Ohio before she married and moved to Kansas, and she ran the school in our district for 8 years. She died 3 years ago of a difficult childbirth, which was a terrible waste of a remarkable mind. "She sounds like she was," Bernard said. "She was the one who told me that a woman's value had nothing to do with what she owned or who her family was," Dorothy said. "She said those were the values of a system designed to keep women manageable, and that any woman who accepted them uncritically had been robbed of something she did not even know she possessed." "She was right," Bernard said, without any qualification or softening, and Dorothy looked at him sideways with an assessing look that he met without flinching. "Most men do not say that," she said. "Most men have not thought carefully about it," he said. "Or they have thought about it and found the conclusion uncomfortable and chosen not to pursue it. I find her logic sound." "You are going to be an interesting man to know," she said. "I hope so," he said. He paused. "You said 14 cents. She looked at him. "Yes." "When you got off the stagecoach?" "Yes." "I have been thinking about that," he said. "About what it costs to step off a stagecoach in a strange town with 14 cents and a carpetbag and the decision to stand straight and manage anyway. That is not a small thing." "It was not a choice," she said. "It was simply what was required." "That is what I mean," he said. They walked in silence for a little while after that, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling. July arrived, and with it Bernard began his construction in earnest. He had the 2 men from Abilene, Crane and Tobias, both experienced builders who had worked on ranch houses across the region, and he worked alongside them every day, because he was not a man to supervise something he could do himself. Dorothy rode out with Mabel one Saturday to see the progress, and she stood on the rise at the north end of the property that Bernard had described and looked out across the grassland and the line of willows along the creek, and felt something in her that was strong and quiet and certain, the feeling of recognizing a place before you know you are going to live there. She had not said yes to anything beyond walking out. She was honest with herself about the sequence of things. They were a couple now, recognized as such by Caldwell's social orbit, which meant they had been the subject of considerable discussion in the ways that small towns manage their social observations. She was comfortable with this. She was not someone who needed the approval of a town's gossip, but she also was not someone who made decisions precipitously, and she believed Bernard was the same kind of person, and that the time they were taking was the right kind of time. But standing on the rise and looking at the creek and the grass and the house frame going up at a steady and solid pace, she thought about morning light through an east-facing window and felt the certain thing settle deeper. The evening in late July, when everything shifted, was not dramatic in its external circumstances. It was a warm evening, and the sky to the west was doing something extraordinary with the color, purple and deep orange and gold, the kind of sunset that made the Kansas plains feel like the most significant place in the world. And Bernard had ridden into town to have dinner at the boarding house, and then had stayed afterward because Mabel had set out coffee and a pie, and the conversation had been good. They were on the front porch when the other boarders had gone in. The evening was cooling slowly, and the town was settling into its nighttime rhythms, and Dorothy was sitting in one of the two porch chairs with her hands folded in her lap, and Bernard was leaning against the porch railing facing her, and they had been talking about his plans for the cattle operation, the particular breed he intended to build his herd from, the markets he was positioning toward. Then he stopped talking about cattle and looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Dorothy, I want to ask you to marry me." She went very still. He did not fill the silence immediately. He gave it to her the way he gave her everything, without pressure or decoration. He looked at her steadily across the porch with his hands resting on the railing behind him and waited. "You are certain," she said, not as a challenge but because she needed to hear his answer to that specific question. "I have not been uncertain about it for some time," he said. "I did not want to ask before you had seen enough of me and enough of what I am building to make a genuine choice. I did not want you to decide from need or desperation. I wanted you to decide from wanting to." She thought about that. She thought about the fact that she was indeed in a position where marriage would have been, practically speaking, a resolution to a set of material uncertainties. She thought about how carefully he had apparently thought about that fact and allowed enough time to pass that it could not be the reason. "You waited," she said. "Yes," he said. "Because you wanted me to be able to say no without catastrophic consequence," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The sky behind him was still doing its extraordinary thing with the colors, though the gold was deepening toward rose now, and the first star had appeared in the east above the dark line of the rooftops. "I am plain and penniless," she said. It was not self-pity. It was a fact stated precisely the same way she had stated it the first time. "Good," he said. "I was not looking for either." She felt the thing in her chest that had been quietly building since the sidewalk collision and the almost smile and the 14 cents and the conversations and the Saturday ride and the North Rise and all the evenings and all the careful, patient, honest time. She felt it resolve into something clear and complete and decided. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He straightened from the railing. He crossed the porch in 2 steps and stood before her, and she rose from the chair, and he took her hands in both of his, which were warm and were roughened and steady. He looked at her face in the last of the colored light. "Thank you," he said, and it was the most sincere thing she had ever heard anyone say in a very short sentence. "Do not thank me," she said. "It is not a favor." "No," he said, and now the full genuine smile was there, unguarded and entirely real. "It is not." He kissed her, there on the front porch, in the quiet dignity of that particular kind of first kiss that is not an impulse but a decision, and she kissed him back with the same quality of decision. And behind the front door of the boarding house, there was the sound of something being knocked over and then hastily set upright, which was certainly Mabel, who had clearly been listening, and they broke apart and Dorothy put her hand over her mouth to keep in the laugh that wanted to come out. and Bernard made a sound that was absolutely laughing, clear and uncontained, the first time she had heard it fully from him, and she found she very much wanted to keep hearing it. They called for Mabel to stop hovering, and she came out with her hands clasped, and her eyes bright, and exclaimed over them, both in the warm, excessive, completely sincere way that was entirely Mabel, and the evening became a celebration of the modest and joyful kind. They were married in September of 1879, in the small Methodist church on Caldwell's Main Street, on a bright morning with the first coolness of fall in the air. Dorothy wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she and Mabel had made together over the previous 2 months, nothing elaborate, but well-made and exactly right for her. She carried a small bunch of the last of the season's wildflowers from the field at the edge of town. Bernard wore a good dark suit and looked at her when she came down the short aisle with an expression that she kept close afterward, the way you keep a thing that is precious and privately yours. Wes Harmon, who it turned out had a fine singing voice, sang a hymn. Mabel cried from the first note. The telegraph operator Simmons read a passage of scripture with solemn enjoyment. Pete the young wrangler tied tin cans to Bernard's horse in the yard outside, which was discovered when they came out, and Bernard looked at the cans and then at Pete, who was grinning with the uncomplicated delight of a 20-year-old, and said, "Very original," in a tone that made everyone laugh. They rode out to the ranch that afternoon, Dorothy and Bernard, the ranch that was no longer just a plan or a frame going up, but a house now with walls and a roof and an east-facing window in the main room. The interior was unfinished in places, the floorboards still raw, one of the interior walls not yet plastered, the kitchen requiring a proper stove that had not yet arrived. But it was solid and real, and it was theirs. Bernard had a fire laid in the fireplace, and he lit it that first evening, and they sat beside it in the 2 chairs he had brought from town, and Dorothy looked at the east-facing window with the dark night outside and thought about the morning light she had imagined standing on the north rise. "I have a wedding present for you," Bernard said. She looked at him. He reached into his jacket and produced a small book, a leather-bound journal, new and clean. "I thought," he said, "you might want to keep a record of what we build here, since you are a person who keeps careful accounts." She took the journal and held it in both hands and looked at it and then at him, and she said, "This is the best thing anyone has given me." "That is a low bar," he said, "given the 14 cents. She laughed and threw the nearest soft thing at him, which was a folded cloth from the arm of his chair, and he caught it and smiled at her with the full genuine smile, and the fire cracked and the night settled around the house, and this was the beginning. The first winter at the ranch was difficult in the way that first winters on new land tend to be. The stove arrived in October, which Crane and Tobias installed before they departed for their next job, and Dorothy was grateful for it in a daily and specific way from the first time she fired it. She plastered the interior wall herself, with Bernard, and with instructions from a manual she borrowed from the church library, and was quietly proud of the result. She laid braided rugs on the raw floors to cut the cold coming up through the boards. She planted a kitchen garden in a sheltered spot on the south side of the house and got it properly settled and covered before the first hard freeze. Bernard began acquiring cattle in the fall, a modest number at first, building carefully. He hired one man to help, a young cowhand named Eli Carter, 22 years old, laconic and capable, who lived in the small bunkroom attached to the back of the barn, and asked for nothing beyond his wages and his meals. Dorothy cooked for Eli along with the rest, and included him in the evening meal when Bernard was there, because she believed that the person who worked your land was entitled to a chair at your table, and Bernard agreed with her on this without it ever requiring argument. She continued to ride into Caldwell twice a week to help Mabel with the accounts, because Mabel still needed someone to reconstruct them at the end of each month, and because she valued the time with her cousin and the connection to the town. She also, on her own initiative, posted a notice at the church, and the general store offering to teach reading and arithmetic to any children in the surrounding area whose families could not easily get them to the school in town. Within 2 weeks she had 6 students, ranging in age from 7 to 14, who came to the ranch on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and sat at the long kitchen table with their slates while Dorothy taught them. Bernard, observing this one Tuesday morning from the barn doorway, watched the 6 children bent over their slates and Dorothy moving among them with quiet authority, and wore an expression that Eli, standing beside him, noticed and elected to say nothing about. "She is good at that," Eli observed eventually, because he was laconic but not entirely silent. "Yes," Bernard said. "You knew she would be," Eli said. "Yes," Bernard said again and went back into the barn. Spring of 1880 brought the first significant test of the ranch's viability. The winter had been harder than average, and while Bernard had taken precautions with feed and shelter, they had lost 3 cattle to a cold snap in February. The creek had frozen solid for 3 weeks, which required daily work breaking the ice for the livestock. Money was tighter than the original calculations had suggested it would be. Dorothy knew this because she kept their accounts with the same meticulous care she had kept Mabel's, and she had told Bernard the numbers directly and without softening, which was both the right thing to do and, she knew, the thing he would have wanted from her regardless. They sat at the kitchen table one March evening with the account book between them and the lamp burning low and went through the figures together. They had enough. They were not in danger, but the margin was narrower than comfort, and they would need a good year from the cattle this summer to build it back to where they wanted it. "We could reduce the number of cattle we are planning to drive to Caldwell this fall," Bernard said, studying the figures. "Or we could look at the feed cost again," Dorothy said, pointing to a line in the accounts. "Eli mentioned the Barlow property to the south has grain they did not sell at harvest. If we contract directly with them rather than through the supply merchant, we save the merchant's margin." Bernard looked at the numbers, made the mental adjustment, and nodded. "That is a better solution," he said. "I know," she said, with a slight smile that was not immodesty but just honesty. He looked up from the accounts and looked at her across the lamp, and the particular quality of that look made her set her pencil down. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking that I made a very good decision." "About the grain contract," she said. "About the sidewalk," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the accounts. Then she said, "Pick up your side of the columns. We are not finished." But she was smiling when she said it, and he was smiling when he looked back down at the figures. That spring Dorothy realized she was expecting their first child. She told Bernard on an April morning when the grass was beginning to green, and the creek was running full and loud after the snowmelt. And she told him in the direct way she told him everything, standing in the kitchen with her hands around a cup of coffee, stating the facts simply. He was at the table and he looked up at her and went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something struck him deeply, and then he stood up and came to her and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady. "Are you well?" he asked, pulling back to look at her. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I feel somewhat different in the mornings, but otherwise I am fine." "Good," he said, and looked at her with an expression so full of something that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. "We are going to need to think about arrangements," she said, when she had collected herself. "I will need a woman who knows midwifery. Mrs. Calloway in Caldwell has been recommended. I will go speak with her this week," he said. "Bernard," she said with a slight exasperation, "I can speak with her myself." "You can," he said, "but it will make me feel useful to do it, and I would appreciate the accommodation." She considered this and decided it was reasonable. "All right," she said, "but I am going with you." He did not argue with this because he knew she would come regardless. The summer of 1880 passed with the particular richness of a season in which many things are growing at once. The cattle were doing well. The kitchen garden was productive beyond what Dorothy had hoped, and she put up preserves against the coming winter with an efficiency that impressed even herself. Her students continued through the summer, with one new addition, a girl of 13 named Rachel Barlow from the neighboring property, whose father had heard about Dorothy's teaching and asked if Rachel might attend. Dorothy's body changed as the months passed, and she adapted to those changes with the practical pragmatism that characterized everything she did. She modified her work as needed without stopping it. She rode less and walked more. She continued the teaching and the accounts and the daily work of the household. Bernard watched her with an attentiveness that was not overprotective so much as deeply present, the way of a man who is paying close attention to something he values enormously. They talked at night, in the particular intimacy of the dark house with the fire banked low and the sounds of the ranch outside, about the child who was coming. They did not know whether it would be a boy or a girl. Bernard said he did not have a preference, which she believed, because he was not a man who believed sons were worth more than daughters. She said she did not have a preference either, which was also true, but that she had some thoughts about names. "If it is a boy," she said, "I would like to name him after my father, Elias." "Elias Lockhart," Bernard said, testing the sound of it. "Yes, that is a good name." "And if it is a girl," she said, "I thought perhaps Clara." He was quiet for a moment, knowing where that name came from. "After your teacher," he said. "Yes," she said. "Clara Lockhart," he said. "That is also a good name." In November of 1880, in the bedroom of the ranch house with Mrs. Calloway attending and Bernard waiting in the kitchen with the kind of rigid, controlled anxiety that was the only version of panic he seemed capable of, Dorothy gave birth to a son. He was healthy and loud, and had a great deal of dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes from what they could tell in the first uncertain days, and his name was Elias Bernard Lockhart, after his grandfather and his father both. Bernard held his son for the first time in the kitchen because Mrs. Calloway had insisted Dorothy sleep, and he had not wanted to leave the house, and he sat in the kitchen chair with Elias in his arms, a bundle so small that it seemed unreasonable, and looked at the infant with an expression so completely unguarded that Dorothy, who had not slept as well as directed and had come out to find him, stood in the doorway for a long moment before he heard her. He looked up. "You should be sleeping," he said. "You should have come in," she said. "I did not want to wake you." She came and sat across from him and looked at her son in his father's arms, and the kitchen was warm and the November night pressed cold against the windows, and she felt the full and completed weight of everything she had built from 14 cents and a carpetbag and the decision to stand straight. "He has your eyes," she said. "It is too early to know that," Bernard said. "I know it anyway," she said. He looked at her across their son, and everything they had been building since the sidewalk collision was in that look, all the honesty and patience and the careful time and the plain truths and the good decisions and the land and the creek and the morning light. "Dorothy," he said. "Bernard," she said. "Thank you," he said, for the second time in a short sentence with all the sincerity she had ever heard from him. "You are going to have to stop thanking me for things," she said. "We are partners. Partners do not thank each other for existing." "I am going to thank you anyway," he said. "You cannot stop me." She looked at him for a long moment with her serious, honest face, and then she smiled, fully and entirely, and said, "No, I suppose I cannot." Little Elias grew in the way that healthy children do, with a speed that seemed impossible if you were watching every day and astonishing in retrospect. He was a good-natured infant, and then a curious toddler, and then a small person with very decided opinions about the world, who followed his father around the ranch with the dedicated intensity of a research project. Dorothy continued teaching. The class grew as word spread further into the surrounding area, and by 1882 she had 12 students on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and she had begun making quiet inquiries about whether the territory would consider sanctioning what she was doing as an official rural school. Bernard supported this with the same straightforward practicality with which he supported everything she did, which included writing a letter to the county school authorities on her behalf and arranging a visit from the school superintendent, a thin, careful man named Good who sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and observed a Tuesday session and left with the expression of someone who has found a thing better than he expected. The sanction came through in the spring of 1882. Dorothy was appointed a certified rural school teacher for the Lockhart Settlement District, which was a name the county had assigned to the cluster of farms and ranches in the area. She received a modest stipend from the county and official status, which meant she could expand her curriculum and formally assess her students. She told Bernard about it on the evening the letter arrived, and he read the letter and then set it on the table and looked at her. "This is what you wanted," he said. "One of the things," she said. "I know," he said, "but this particular one, the teaching." "Yes," she said. "I wanted to be Mrs. Yount for someone else. For as many someone elses as I could manage." He pushed the letter across the table toward her and said, "You already are. You have been since the first Tuesday." She picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in the journal he had given her as a wedding present, the journal she had been keeping since that first evening in the ranch house by the fire, which was now nearly full. Eli Carter, their ranch hand, was by 1882 as much a fixture of the Lockhart place as the creek and the willows. He was 25 and had grown into himself in the years he had been there, steadier and more confident than the laconic young man who had first arrived. He had also developed a quiet and careful friendship with Rachel Barlow, the 13-year-old girl who had first come to Dorothy's lessons and was now 17 and still coming, having outpaced most of the younger students and taken to helping Dorothy teach the arithmetic. Dorothy watched this friendship between Eli and Rachel with the same attentive observation she brought to everything, and noted its progress, and said nothing until Rachel was 18, and the friendship had become something clearly more than that, at which point she mentioned to Eli, in passing and without drama, that his intentions toward Rachel would benefit from being stated to Rachel's father directly rather than continued in the peripheral and careful fashion of a man who does not know if he has permission to want what he wants. Eli turned red to his collar and said, "Yes, ma'am." He spoke to Gideon Barlow that same week, and Rachel Barlow became Rachel Carter in a small ceremony the following spring, and Dorothy thought about the way things grow when you give them the right conditions and enough honest attention. The winter of 1882 into 1883 brought a development that Dorothy noted in her journal with the same careful recording she brought to everything. She was expecting again. She was 28 years old and Elias was 2, and the ranch was doing well, and the school was established, and she felt, examining the fact from all angles, that she was ready for this in a way that had not been possible in her first pregnancy, simply from having done it once before. She told Bernard on a December evening by the fire, with Elias asleep in his small bedroom down the hall. Bernard received this news with the same stillness and then the same unguarded warmth as the first time, and she thought it was one of his best qualities, that things did not diminish in their capacity to move him simply because they had happened before. "Are you feeling well?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "though I have the same difficulty with mornings." "I know," he said. "I have been making your coffee and leaving it at the bedroom door." She looked at him. "That is what the cup in the morning is." "For the past 3 weeks, yes," he said, with perfect composure. She looked at him for a long moment. "Bernard," she said. "Dorothy," he said. "You are a very decent man," she said. He looked at her, and the warmth in his expression was the kind that does not announce itself but simply is, the way the morning light came through the east-facing window, steady and present and entirely reliable. "You are a very decent woman," he said, "and a remarkable one." Their second child was born in July of 1883, a girl, healthy and with Dorothy's dark hair, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as determined. Her name was Clara Yount Lockhart, after the teacher who had told Dorothy that a woman's value had nothing to do with what she owned, and Dorothy held her daughter for the first time and thought about Clara Yount with a gratitude that moved through her like a current. Bernard held Clara with the same careful reverence he had held Elias, and Elias, who was now 3 and had some opinions about this new situation, was brought to meet his sister and examined her with the grave seriousness of someone evaluating an unfamiliar phenomenon, and then declared her very small, which seemed to be a neutral assessment. "She is quite small," Bernard agreed. Elias considered this further. "She will get bigger," he said. "She will," Dorothy said. Elias seemed reassured by this logic and went back to whatever he had been doing before the interruption, and Dorothy met Bernard's eyes over their daughter, and they shared the private wordless laugh of parents recognizing something their child had said that was both funny and perfectly sensible. The years settled and deepened. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically, but with the solid incremental progress of something built on good foundations rather than hope and shortcuts. Bernard added to the herd carefully, expanded the grazing range by a leasing arrangement with a neighboring property whose owner had moved east, and put a second man on alongside Eli when the work warranted it. The house itself grew too. 2 additional rooms added in 1884 as the children grew, and the space required it. The new rooms built by Bernard and Eli over the course of a summer, with the same methodical care that had built the first house. Dorothy's school continued to be the thing she was known for in the wider district, the way that Bernard was known for the quality of his cattle. She had a gift for finding the angle from which a difficult concept became clear to a particular student, a patient and attentive gift, and she deployed it without condescension. Some of her earliest students were now young adults who read fluently and could manage their family accounts with a confidence they had not had before, and occasionally one of them would come to her to say so, and she would receive these acknowledgments with quiet gratitude and go on. Mabel came out to the ranch for Sunday dinner at least twice a month, and the friendship between the cousins deepened into the comfortable and irreplaceable variety that is built from years of shared difficulty and shared joy. Mabel's boarding house had prospered steadily, and she had paid back Bernard's loan to the cent. With interest he had tried to refuse, and she had refused to let him refuse. Mabel had no husband, but seemed to have arranged her life in a way that suited her completely, managing her house and her boarders and her various social obligations with the cheerful authority of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. In the summer of 1885, Bernard came home from a ride along the south boundary of the property, with something thoughtful about his expression that Dorothy recognized as the specific configuration of a man who has been turning an idea over for several hours and is ready to present it. She waited until after supper when the children were in bed and the kitchen was quiet and poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat down and looked at him. "The Anderson parcel," he said. She knew the Anderson parcel. It was 80 acres directly south of their current boundary, good flat grass with a seasonal pond. Old Anderson had been trying to decide whether to sell for 2 years. "He has decided to sell," she said. "How did you know that?" Bernard said. "I saw his wife in Caldwell last week, and she had a particular look about her," Dorothy said. "The look of someone who has won an argument they have been having for some time." Bernard shook his head slightly with the expression of someone who has long since accepted that his wife reads people with an accuracy he finds both impressive and occasionally unnecessary. "Yes," he said. "He came to see me today. The price is fair." "Can we manage it?" she said. "If we use the reserve that we have been building over the last 3 years," he said. "It will be tight for the first season, but the additional grazing will offset the cost by the second year." "Show me the numbers," she said. He showed her the numbers. She went through them with her pencil and the particular focused attention she brought to figures, checking his arithmetic and adding the calculations she thought he had not included, and found that he was right. They could manage it. It would be tight, but it would be manageable, and the long-term value was clear. "Buy it," she said. He looked at her. "Just like that." "I have looked at your figures and they are sound," she said. "When the figures are sound, you do not wait." He bought the Anderson parcel the following week, and by the following summer the cattle on the expanded range were doing exactly what the figures had predicted, and the tightness of that first season became a memory rather than a worry. There was a morning in the fall of 1886 that Dorothy entered in her journal with more detail than most mornings warranted. It was an October morning, and the grass had gone golden, and the cottonwoods along the creek were the particular burning yellow that they achieved each year for about 2 weeks before the leaves let go, and she had gotten up before anyone else, a thing she sometimes did, and gone out to stand on the north rise in the early cool and look at the ranch in the first light. The house was solid and warm-looking below her, smoke beginning from the kitchen chimney where the fire had caught on its own, the way she had arranged it the night before. The barn was sound. The cattle were visible on the south range, quiet and dark against the golden grass. The creek line of willows ran green against the gold. Eli Carter's small house, which Bernard had helped him build when he and Rachel married, sat at the edge of the property with the morning light on its windows. Dorothy stood on the rise and put her hand over her eyes against the low eastern sun and looked at all of it, at what had been built from a parcel of Kansas land and 2 people who had been honest with each other from the beginning. She thought about the 14 cents. She thought about the sidewalk and the carpetbag and the almost smile, and the coffee being left outside her bedroom door for 3 weeks before she noticed. She thought about Bernard saying, "Good, I was not looking for either," and the way the words had reorganized something fundamental inside her. She heard footsteps behind her and did not need to turn to know them. Bernard came and stood beside her on the rise, close enough that his arm was against hers in the morning chill, and looked at the ranch the way she was looking at it, with the comprehensive attention of someone reviewing the work. "You are out early," he said. "I wanted to look at it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "So do I," he said. Every morning she looked at him. He was looking at the ranch, the cattle and the barn and the house and the creek, and his face in the morning light had the particular quality she associated with his deepest feelings, the unguarded quality, the one that did not appear often in public but that she saw regularly and privately, and had come to consider one of the great privileges of her life. "We built something good," she said. "We did," he said. She slipped her hand into his, which was warm despite the morning chill, and he closed his fingers around hers in the easy, certain way of 7 years. "Bernard," she said, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her then, with the full attention she had always valued. "I'm expecting again," she said. He went still, that same particular stillness, and then the same warmth breaking through, and then he did something he had never quite done before in this specific way. He laughed first, before anything else, a sound that was purely joyful, uncontained, the way she had first heard him laugh on Mabel's porch, and then he pulled her against him there on the north rise with the burning yellow cottonwoods and the morning light and the whole of what they had made visible below them. "Good Lord," he said into her hair. "You will have to build another room," she said. "I have built rooms before," he said. "You will need to tell Elias and Clara," she said. "Elias will have opinions." "Elias always has opinions," he said. "He gets that from you." "He gets it from both of us," she said, which was true. He was quiet, holding her, and she felt his breathing, and the morning was still around them. Then he said, "Dorothy." "Bernard," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "for some time about something I want to say to you, and I have not found the right way to say it." "You always find the right way," she said. "You are just particular about the timing." "Yes," he said. "The timing felt important for this." He paused. "You were the 14 cents, Dorothy, not the money. What you were carrying in you when you got off that stagecoach. The knowledge of what you were worth, even when everything around you was telling you the accounting was negative. That was the thing I saw on the sidewalk." She was quiet against him. "I did not fall in love with your circumstances," he said. "I fell in love with the way you stood in them." She thought about Clara Yount and what she had taught her. She thought about her father, who had stood straight until the fever took him. She thought about 14 cents carried with the same composure one might carry a fortune, because it was all she had, and she had not been going to be ashamed of it. "That is the most words you have said consecutively about a feeling," she said finally. "It has been building for 7 years," he said. "It warranted a thorough delivery." She laughed and turned in his arms to look at him with the morning light between them, and his face was the face she knew better now than any face in the world, the honest, considered face with the gray-green eyes, the face that took its time before it decided anything and then decided fully. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since the land office argument, I think, though I did not know it quite yet." "I know," he said. "I loved you since you said you had 14 cents without flinching." The third child arrived in the spring of 1887, another boy, whom they named James Elias Lockhart, after nobody and everybody, because the name was simply right. He had his mother's brown eyes and his father's calm temperament, and his brother's initial assessment of him was that he was also very small, delivered with an air of someone who has seen this before and knows how it resolves. Clara, who was nearly 4 and had inherited Dorothy's direct observational quality, examined her new brother and said, "He looks like Papa," which Dorothy thought was probably accurate, and which made Bernard look at his daughter with an expression of surprised pleasure. The Lockhart ranch settled into the rhythms of itself with 3 children and 2 ranch hands, and a school that met twice a week in accounts that were kept current, and a marriage that was the warm and working and deeply private kind, the kind that is not witnessed much in public because most of its texture is interior, made of conversations in the dark and cups of coffee, and the accumulated knowledge of another person built over years. Dorothy filled her journal and started a second one. She wrote about the children's growth and the ranch's seasons and her students and the things she and Bernard talked about, and the things they did not need to talk about, because they had been known between them long enough to exist without words. She wrote about the light on the creek in different seasons, and the way the sky over Kansas was never the same 2 days running, and the smell of the grass after rain, which Bernard had described to her once with a particular precision that she thought about often. She wrote on a September page in 1887, 8 years after she had stepped off a stagecoach with 14 cents, and whatever courage she had managed to carry. "I understand now what Mrs. Yount meant when she said the accounting was wrong. She meant that the values were wrong, not the woman doing the accounting. She meant that what a person was worth had never been a matter of what they owned, and that any system that said otherwise was lying. I knew that. I believed it in the way you believe a thing you have been told by someone you trust. But I know it differently now, from the inside of it, from the experience of being worth nothing by those measures, and being met by someone who was using entirely different measures altogether, and of building from there together, something that has a value no accounting I have ever seen could accurately describe." She closed the journal and set her pencil down and looked across the kitchen table where Bernard sat in the lamplight going through the ranch accounts, his reading glasses on his nose, a recent acquisition he had accepted with the same pragmatic equanimity he brought to everything. He looked up and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She considered the full answer to that question, which would have taken some time to deliver properly. She looked at her husband in the lamplight of their kitchen, in the house he had described to her before it was built, on the land with the creek and the willows and the north rise, with their children asleep down the hall and the ranch quiet outside, and all 8 years of what they had made together present in the room around them. "About 14 cents, she said. He looked at her over his reading glasses with those gray-green eyes, and understood exactly what she meant, because he always had and always would. "Good starting capital," he said. "The best," she said and smiled, and the lamplight held them both, and outside the window the Kansas night was vast and full of stars, and the ranch breathed around them in the dark, steady and certain and entirely theirs. In the years that followed, the Lockhart Ranch became one of the well-regarded small operations in the Caldwell district, not the largest or the wealthiest, but consistently sound and consistently honest, the way its founders were. Bernard's reputation grew as a man whose handshake meant what it said, and whose cattle were what he represented them to be. And Dorothy's reputation grew as a teacher who had genuinely changed the course of things for the families in the surrounding area who had sent their children to her kitchen table. Elias, as he grew, showed his father's judgment about land and his mother's stubbornness about principle, a combination that suggested he would manage something of his own one day. Clara showed her mother's gift for teaching and her father's precision with figures, and was already, at 7, the unofficial explainer of all difficult concepts to her younger brother James, who absorbed information readily and had opinions about everything he absorbed. Mabel came for Sunday dinners until her arthritis made the ride uncomfortable, at which point Dorothy reversed the arrangement and went to Caldwell on Sundays to have dinner with Mabel and check her accounts, which still required reconstruction at the end of each month even after all these years. This was, Dorothy thought, not really about arithmetic at all, and never had been. The boarding house was inherited in due course by a young woman from Ohio named Agnes, who was Mabel's niece on her husband's side, a competent and warm-hearted young woman who kept the house the way Mabel had kept it, and who also, eventually, found occasion to have a conversation with a man from a nearby ranch who was direct in his speaking and decent in his intentions, and Dorothy thought she recognized something in that pattern and was glad of it. She had lived long enough and loved clearly enough to know that the particular quality of what she and Bernard had was not common, not because the feeling was rare, but because the conditions that produced it were not always present. The willingness to be plain about what you were and what you had and what you needed. The willingness to hear that plainness and answer it honestly. The patience to let a thing grow at the speed of truth rather than the speed of need. She knew it because she had seen the alternatives in the lives around her and had understood from the beginning what she would not accept and what she could not give without diminishment. And she had been lucky enough, and stubborn enough, and clear-eyed enough to wait until she encountered someone who was using the same measures she was. On the evening that Dorothy and Bernard marked their 10th anniversary, quietly, with supper at their own table and the children in bed and Mabel's best preserves opened for the occasion, Bernard poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat across the table and looked at her in the lamplight. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she said. Are you satisfied with the arrangement? He said, and there was the ghost of the almost smile she had first seen on the sidewalk. Still there, after all this time, still the precursor to the full genuine one. She looked at him with her honest, serious face that changed entirely when she smiled. And she smiled now, fully and completely and without reservation, and said, I am more than satisfied. I am exactly where I intended to be. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had taken it on the North Rise on an October morning years ago, certain and familiar and warm. And outside the window the Kansas night was what it always was, wide and deep and full of stars. And inside the lamplight held them, and there was nothing more that needed saying, and nothing that remained unresolved, and every account was current and every figure balanced, and the thing they had built together was solid and real and would stand.